She has been silent for 7 months, Tribune, yet she whispered your family name into the darkness this morning. Tribune Cassian froze in the hallway of the Praetorium. The voice belonged to Livia, a young attendant, trembling against the cold stone. Cassian, a man carved from granite and Roman discipline, gripped the bronze handle of the door. The woman, a captive brought back from the brutal Dacian forests, was known only as the Silent. She was a living trophy, a broken symbol of Rome's victory. Silence was acceptance, whisper was treason. The idea that she knew his lineage, the name reserved for the emperor's highest favor, ruptured the fragile peace of his garrison. Cassian pushed the door open, the sound echoing in the oppressive, sudden silence of the corridor, knowing that the cost of her secret had just been transferred directly to his own throat. The morning ritual of Tribune Cassian was a precisely calibrated mechanism, designed to project absolute control. He stood before the polished bronze cuirass, allowing his orderly Marius to secure the intricate leather straps. Each movement was studied, efficient, devoid of unnecessary emotion, a mirror of the Legio III Italica he commanded on the uneasy northern frontier. Outside the Praetorium, the roar of the morning muster was a comforting, familiar wave of collective obedience. Cassian was the embodiment of the Pax Romana here. His decisions were law. His presence was the boundary between civilization and the untamed forests of Germania. He walked the battlements before sunrise every day, not to inspect the defenses, the centurions were competent, but to feel the cold, unrelenting wind that was a constant reminder of the impermanence of Rome's grasp. Below him, the castra bustled. Thousands of men moved with purpose, building, training, swearing allegiance to the eagle. Cassian acknowledged the salutes with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had earned this authority through 20 years of blood and discipline, ascending the ranks until he was the emperor's chosen instrument in this desolate land. His power was total, but absolute power demanded an absolute suppression of self. His private quarters, stark and Spartan, reflected his internal landscape. The only ornamentation was a small, dusty bronze bust of his son, Lucian. Lucian had been dead 7 years, swallowed by the Rhine during a minor skirmish that Cassian, now tribune, had overseen as a young legate. It was a skirmish that should have been avoided. Lucian, 17 and eager for glory, had rushed the riverbank. Cassian remembered the precise sound of the arrow hitting the boy's chest, the brief, impossible look of betrayal in his eyes before the current took him. He was a father who had delivered his son to the river. The guilt was not a heavy cloak, but a meticulous, internal chisel, refining his discipline into something brittle and unforgiving. He had buried his grief under layers of Roman duty, turning himself into the perfect tribune, cold, brilliant, and untouchable. In his office, parchment scrolls detailed troop movements and supply lines, but his gaze kept returning to a corner of the room near the small brazier. It was the detention area for the few high-value prisoners taken during the recent Dacian campaign. Most were already sold into slavery or executed. Only one remained, the woman known only as the Silent. She was meant to be a political bargaining chip, but her complete refusal to speak, to even acknowledge the Romans, had turned her into an obsession for the camp. Cassian had ordered her to be treated fairly, kept warm, and fed. He demanded silence from his soldiers, but her silence felt like a judgment. The attendant, Livia, was waiting for him, her face pale. "Tribune, about what I said." "The matter is handled, Livia." Cassian cut her off, his voice flat. A stressed mind often confuses memory with imagination. Livia swallowed hard, stepping back. But as Cassian turned back toward his desk, he noticed the small, carved wooden toy she had left behind, a simple horse. Lucian had always loved horses. The Silent had been carving small, simple objects with stolen charcoal and wood splinters. The fear was rising, sharp and cold, through Cassian's disciplined exterior. If the prisoner knew his son's name, it meant the connection was deeper, older, and perhaps more dangerous than any political treachery. It was a debt the Empire had forgotten, but which the frontier never forgave. Elias was dust and leather, a man aged by the sun and the grinding gears of Roman bureaucracy. He was a Caligarius, a cobbler attached to the 3rd Legion, responsible for the thousands of heavy military boots that constantly demanded repair. His life was spent bent over the last, the rhythmic hammer blows muffling the constant anxiety in his chest. Elias had no power, only utility. He was respected only so far as his hands were quick and his leather held firm. His limitation was his poverty, his weakness, his sight. His vision blurred at the edges of the day, a subtle impediment he desperately hid from the centurions. If he couldn't stitch the seam straight, he would be replaced, demoted, and left to starve outside the walls. His small tent, tucked behind the legionary barracks, smelled perpetually of oil and sweat. Inside there was only one thing he truly protected, a small, smooth river stone painted faintly blue. It had belonged to his daughter Ilara, who was back in Rome with his estranged sister. He sent almost all his meager pay home, dreaming of the day he could afford to buy land and bring her back to him, far from the harsh reality of the legionary camp. This hope was the fragile membrane that kept him whole. Elias had been the one assigned, a month earlier, to repair the sandals and thick hide bindings of the high-value prisoners. Most were easy work, quickly done. But there was the one, the silent Dacian woman. He delivered her new bindings twice weekly, always under the watchful, bored eye of a guard. She never looked at him, never acknowledged his presence. Her silence was a wall, thick and absolute. But Elias had keen eyes for detail, the kind of necessary precision acquired by decades of working with fine materials. He had noticed things the guards dismissed. The first was the quality of her handiwork. She wasn't simply scratching designs, she was carving objects with intent. The small horse Livia had found was just the latest. Elias had seen the charcoal drawings on the back of stale bread wrappers, maps or symbols, rendered with an impossible accuracy that belied her captivity. The second thing, the thing that clawed at his sleep, was the subtle shift in her hands. A few weeks ago, while replacing the thongs on her boots, he'd seen a specific scar on her palm, a crescent moon mark. Yesterday, when he returned with a newly waterproofed pair, he noticed she was wearing a thin silver ring on her thumb, a common enough ornamentation, except that the crescent scar was almost perfectly reflected in the ring's intricate carving. The ring was not Roman. It was not Dacian. Elias had seen that symbol before, years ago in a provincial outpost far to the east, during a supply route mission. He had repaired the ornate riding saddle of a senior senator returning from diplomatic duty. The senator's crest, discreetly placed beneath the leather flap, was the same interlocking crescent. It was not a military sigil, but a mark of a specific, powerful, and utterly secret Roman political faction, a faction known to oppose the emperor's expansionist policies in the north. The silent woman was not a trophy. She was a message, and she was weaving that message into the very fabric of the garrison, right under Tribune Cassian's nose. Elias knew the danger of such knowledge. Silence might be safety, but in a Roman camp, knowing a secret was a death sentence waiting for the right moment to be executed. He clutched his riverstone, the blue paint cold against his thumb. He was tired, but the weight of this invisible war was heavier than any soldier's pack. Onde você está assistindo hoje? The first true collision occurred not through direct contact, but through the mundane mechanism of camp logistics. Cassian, driven by the unease Livia's whisper had instilled, had doubled the oversight on the silent. He ordered a daily inventory of everything entering and leaving her confinement area, disguised as a new security protocol to prevent escape attempts. He reviewed the lists in his study, looking for anomalies, any unauthorized scrap of parchment, any unusual food item, anything that suggested communication. He found nothing. The official records were immaculate, but the daily reports inevitably crossed the path of Elias. As the Caligarius, he was required to account for all leather and wood supplies used by the prisoners, ensuring they were not being fashioned into weapons. Elias presented his meticulously tallied ledger to the quartermaster, Lucius, a man whose ambition was as vast as his incompetence. Lucius merely skimmed the numbers, impatient to finish his duties and gamble in the vicus. Elias noticed the change on the inventory list for the prisoners' tools. Officially, the Silent was provided only with dull bone needles for mending her own rough clothing. But the official record for miscellaneous scraps of softwood used in the past week had jumped drastically, far more than the usual allowance for kindling. Lucius waved it off as poor logging by the guards. "The cold is harsh, cobbler. They burn what they can find," Lucius grumbled, stamping the ledger without checking the storage shed. Elias knew better. The softwood listed was a rare variety, dense and excellent for detailed carving, not efficient for burning. It was the material the Silent was using for her hidden work. But the true point of intersection came with the requisition of leather. Elias had signed out a batch of fine, treated goat hide, material far too expensive for a prisoner's simple repair work. He checked the destination on the slip. Tribune's personal office, immediate repair to ceremonial gear. Cassian was focused on finding a flaw in the prisoner's environment. But the prisoner was subtly influencing his own. Elias realized the Silent woman was obtaining her supplies, the specialized wood, perhaps even tools, through the Tribune's personal channels, concealed within his own supply chain. It was an insult to the Tribune's authority, a breathtaking act of proximity-based subversion. That afternoon, Elias delivered the repaired ceremonial saddle straps to Cassian's private stable. He saw Cassian for only a moment, mounted on his heavy warhorse, preparing for a routine patrol. Cassian was the picture of Roman strength, all shining bronze and focused determination. Elias, bent low in subservience, was nothing. Yet as Cassian rode past, Elias noticed a tiny, almost invisible scratch on the Tribune's saddle flap, directly beneath the strap he had just repaired. It was a single, stylized line. It meant nothing to Cassian, but Elias recognized the signature. It was the same precise curve he had seen faintly scratched on the riverstone of his daughter, the same style as the carvings made by the captive. The Silent was communicating with someone in power, and she was using the Tribune's own belongings as her message board. Cassian was sitting on the secret, literally. Elias felt a sudden, crushing weight. He was the only man in the Castra who saw the pattern, the only one who handled both the prisoner's scraps and the Tribune's luxuries. Something profound and terrible was gathering speed beneath the surface of the Legion. The persistent anxiety settled into Elias's bones. He began scrutinizing every piece of leather that passed through his hands, treating the stitching like coded script. The details he saw were too small, too localized for anyone else to notice, buried beneath the urgency of daily camp maintenance. The guards saw only boots. Elias saw evidence. The major signal, the one that shattered his forced neutrality, came late one evening. Elias was repairing the boots of Optio Severus, a hard-drinking, ambitious officer known for his brutal efficiency and fierce loyalty to Cassian. Severus's boots were always meticulously clean, a mark of his discipline. As Elias removed the sole for new padding, he noticed a deep gouge inside the arch, fresh and poorly concealed. He carefully scraped away the dried mud. Embedded in the gouge was a minute, almost invisible sliver of wood. Not common pine, but the expensive, dense softwood logged onto Cassian's personal roster, the same wood the Silent woman used for her carvings. The sliver had a faint residual odor of rare frankincense, a scent that Severus, a pragmatic soldier, would never use. Frankincense was for religious ceremony, or for the private quarters of high-ranking officials traveling long distances. Elias's hands shook. He knew Severus visited the prisoner's area daily for inspection. Why would the Optio have a piece of her rare carving material embedded in his boot, along with the scent of an expensive ceremonial perfume? He recalled the silver ring with the crescent moon mark. He recalled the senatorial crest. He now recognized the deep danger. The Silent was not communicating with the Tribune's logistics. She was communicating through a high-ranking officer. Severus was the conduit, an internal mole. The message was being delivered from the captive via the Tribune's supplies, right out into the field, under the guise of the Tribune's authority. The revelation was paralyzing. Severus was untouchable, protected by his reputation. To accuse an Optio of treason based on a splinter of wood and a faint scent of frankincense was madness. It meant instantaneous execution for Elias. He had Ilara to think of, the money for her passage back to him. If he spoke, he lost everything, and his daughter would remain stranded. He considered placing the evidence back, letting the mud conceal the splinter, and going back to his quiet, anonymous life. "It is not your war, cobbler. Rome has enough problems without your intervention." But the image of the carved horse, the small object that had briefly sat on Cassian's desk, returned to him. It was a sign of human connection, an impossible plea for communication across the lines of war. If Severus was involved, the silent woman's safety was forfeit. Her silence was about to be forcibly broken, perhaps leading to Cassian's political downfall, or worse, a genuine disruption in the legion that would cost hundreds of lives. Elias carefully removed the sliver with his finest needle. He wrapped it in a piece of oiled linen and tucked it inside the painted riverstone, deep within his boot-making kit. He had the proof, but now he faced the terrifying reality of what to do with it. He was a cobbler facing down a tribune and a network of treason. He felt the cold pressure of the empire demanding obedience, but the small, silent voice of human decency was finally starting to drown out the noise of his fear. He could not ignore the signal anymore. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Castra was charged with a heavy military static. Intelligence reports confirmed a massive concentration of Dacian forces gathering just beyond the eastern ridge, a coordinated movement unlike anything seen in months. Tribune Cassian was immersed in war council, and every soldier was mobilized. This was Elias's window and his last chance. In the chaos of preparing for imminent combat, no one would notice a simple cobbler crossing the central courtyard. He found the centurion commanding the guard rotation, a grim veteran named Valerius loading supplies onto a heavy cart. Valerius was fair, if ruthless, and possessed a strict adherence to Roman law over personal loyalty. Elias approached him, his heart hammering against his ribs, making his voice shaky. "Centurion, I require access to the tribune's stable stores. An urgent repair on the ceremonial harness. It must be perfect for the march." Valerius eyed the cobbler with irritation, waving him past without a word. Cassian's gear always took priority. Elias moved quickly to the stable, but bypassed the harness room. He went instead to Cassian's personal armory chest, a heavy iron-bound trunk kept separate from the public stores. He had no key. He had no authority. He had only a moment before a guard noticed. He produced the sliver of softwood, the one smelling of frankincense. He used a tiny hook door, a tool of his trade, to meticulously insert the sliver into the hinge of the trunk's main lock. It was a precise, deliberate sabotage. The splinter was just small enough to allow the key to turn, but thin enough to break the moment the trunk was opened, and then slammed shut in haste, leaving tiny fragments inside the mechanism. The fragments would be identifiable under careful inspection, proving that wood from the prisoner's enclosure, tainted with a high-status aroma, had physically interfered with the tribune's most secure belongings. It was not a denunciation. It was a physical, unmissable piece of evidence left directly on the doorstep of power. Elias did not risk confronting Cassian directly. He simply left a mechanical certainty of failure. As he was retreating, he nearly collided with Optio Severus, who was marching toward the stables, his face tight with strained authority. "Cobbler, what business do you have near the tribune's personal effects?" Severus's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. Elias felt the immediate, consuming terror. He bowed low, exaggerating his subservience. "Forgive me, Optio, replacing the stirrup padding. Must ensure the tribune rides securely into battle." He kept his hands visible, empty. Severus dismissed him with a contemptuous wave. "Be quick, old man. We march within the hour." Elias walked away, his back prickling, knowing that Severus had barely spared him a glance, but the danger was irreversible. He had committed an act of treason to protect the truth. The clock was ticking. The tribune would open that chest before riding out. The mechanism would break. Cassian would be forced to ask, why? Elias had placed his fragile life directly in the path of the imperial machinery, praying that the tribune's deep-seated sense of duty was stronger than his instinct for immediate revenge. The story had pivoted violently. The cobbler's fear had given way to a desperate, calculating courage. Tribune Cassian was already armored, standing rigidly by the map table, issuing final orders for the imminent campaign, when Marius, his orderly, entered with poorly masked panic. "Tribune, the armory chest, the lock is seized. We cannot retrieve the official campaign standard or your signet." Cassian felt a vein throb in his temple. In an hour of absolute urgency, this petty mechanical failure was infuriating. "Break it open, Marius. We need the seal." "We tried, Tribune, but the mechanism is tightly wedged. It seems sabotaged. There are fine splinters inside." Marius held out a small bent piece of metal that had been part of the internal locking system. Cassian stared at the shard. A sudden, sharp memory of the cobbler Elias lingering near the stable earlier, and Livia's forgotten small wooden horse, sliced through his focus. He dismissed the centurions with a clipped command and turned to Marius. "Fetch the Caligarius, now, and bring Optio Severus to my office. Immediately." His voice was low, terrifyingly controlled. When Elias was dragged into the tribune's office, he saw the fragments of wood spread across the mahogany desk, catching the weak morning light. Cassian did not shout. He simply pointed at the fragments. "Explain, cobbler." Elias, exhausted but braced, knew he could not lie now. "That wood is softwood, Tribune, designated only for the Dacian captives' use. I believe it was placed deliberately to force an inspection of the lock's contents, or the lock itself." Cassian's eyes, usually distant, locked onto Elias. "Who planted it?" Before Elias could answer, Optio Severus entered, his posture radiating confidence. "Tribune, the men are ready. The delay—" Cassian interrupted him, his gaze never leaving Severus. "Optio, the lock on my personal chest was breached. It contained my campaign directives. Did you handle any of my personal effects this morning, or yesterday?" Severus paled slightly, but recovered swiftly. "No, Tribune. I was inspecting the perimeter defenses, as ordered. And yet, Optio," Cassian continued, moving towards him slowly, "this wood, sourced from the prisoner's limited stores, was found lodged in the mechanism, and this scent." Cassian picked up one fragment and crushed it lightly between his gloved fingers, then offered it to Severus. "Frankincense, a scent often found on diplomats returning from the East, or perhaps on expensive, highly treated leather goods. Did you visit the captive's cell, Optio?" Severus's demeanor cracked. His arrogance dissolved into cold panic. "It is a tactical diversion, Tribune. The cobbler is lying, perhaps intimidated by the enemy." "The cobbler is the only one who handles both my high-grade saddle leather and the prisoner's raw hide," Cassian countered, his voice like iron scraping stone. "He sees the connections that we in our high tower miss." Cassian's hand slammed down on the desk, startling Severus. "I know the senatorial faction, Optio. I know their obsession with slowing the northern expansion. The Silent is not a trophy. She is a courier, sending coded messages through her carvings, delivered by you, disguised in the logistical flow. You were using my personal gear as a dead drop." The realization was a punch to Cassian's gut. The conspiracy had been living in his shadow, using his own authority against him. He felt an intense surge of personal betrayal. The war on the frontier was one thing. The treachery within his own ranks, using a silent woman as a pawn, was intolerable. Cassian pointed at the door. "Marius, arrest Optio Severus, treason, confine him immediately. The Legion must not see this collapse of authority. We are in a state of crisis." The military tension was now internal. Cassian had to secure the camp, interrogate the conspirator, and understand the captive's full message before he could even face the Dacian enemy massing outside the walls. His command was compromised, and the clock of war was ticking rapidly. Cassian stood outside the small, cold cell where the Silent had been kept for months. He dismissed the guards, needing the confrontation to be clean, immediate, and without witnesses. He entered the space, which smelled faintly of smoke and the earthy aroma of carved wood. The Silent sat on her cot, her back straight, her silver ring catching the faint light filtering through the high window. She finally looked up, her eyes, a startling shade of deep amber, meeting his with an unnerving lack of fear. "You know my name, I am told," Cassian said, his voice flat. He discarded the formality of the Tribune title. "My family name, Cassian." The Silent remained still, but her lips parted slightly, the first intentional movement he had seen. She did not speak, but she nodded once, a slow, deliberate confirmation. "Why?" he demanded. "Why use my men, my supplies, my name to send messages to your senatorial handlers in Rome? Severus has confessed enough to confirm the outline of the plot. They wanted me recalled, the legion destabilized, to force a peaceful, negotiated border, a position that benefits their own holdings." She lifted her hand, pointing to the wall where she had etched faint, complex lines with charcoal. It wasn't a map of troop movements. It was a genealogical chart painstakingly detailed. At the very center, she pointed to the name L. Lucianus Cassianus, his dead son, Lucian. "That is my son. He is dead. What connection could you possibly claim?" Cassian's disciplined exterior began to fracture, the grief he had buried rising to the surface, acidic and sharp. The Silent reached beneath her cot and retrieved a small object he hadn't seen before, a worn leather pouch. She opened it and poured out a small pile of polished stones. Among them was the painted blue river stone, the one Elias cherished. But next to it was another, slightly larger white stone, etched with a single clear symbol, the Dacian equivalent of the Roman numeral 5. She finally spoke, her voice rusty, unused, yet carrying the melodic cadence of the Dacian tongue. Cassian understood the language from years on the frontier, a deliberate choice of isolation that now paid a terrible dividend. "I am Varia. I am not a courier for senators. I was the wife of the chieftain's 5th son, captured on the riverbank during the skirmish 7 years ago, the one where the Roman boy died." Cassian's breath hitched. He remembered the reports, a brief, brutal exchange, a Dacian leader's son lost to the current, but the Romans had found no body. "My husband, the 5th son, he was wounded. He did not die in the river. Your son, Lucian, saw his chance, pushed past his men and struck him down, taking his signet ring as a trophy. Then Lucian fell into the current himself. Both were lost to the flow. But my husband survived." Cassian stared, horrified. The official account, the story of accidental death and tragedy, was a lie. His son had been killed in a moment of reckless ambition and personal combat, not by a random arrow. "My husband was the one sending the messages," Varia continued, her eyes wet but fierce. "He infiltrated the senatorial network, using their desire for peace to create chaos. He needed to know which general commanded here, who held the power. He needed his ring back. He needed proof of the dishonor shown to his brother, the chieftain's son whom Lucian killed." She pointed to the silver ring on her thumb. "This ring is his. It is identical to the one your son took. He used Severus to confirm you, Cassian, were Lucian's father. He needed to confirm that the tribune of the Third Legion bore the guilt of his son's reckless act. You were not a target of politics, Tribune. You were a target of vengeance, personal and complete." The truth was a heavy, suffocating weight. Cassian's power was built on a lie of honorable loss. The Empire's problem was not treason. It was the inevitable return of a past Cassian had tried to bury. The grief for his son transformed instantly into a cold, terrifying understanding of responsibility. He realized Varia was not the true captive. He was. The consequences were immediate and structural. Severus, interrogated under pressure, confessed to his role in the information exchange, confirming that the chieftain's surviving son, using the senatorial contacts, planned to destabilize the frontier by provoking a full-scale battle, ensuring Cassian's forces were drawn out and vulnerable. The goal was to force the emperor to replace Cassian with a weaker, more politically compliant general. The plan was brilliant, relying entirely on Rome's internal corruption. Cassian, facing the truth of his son's death and the massive conspiracy, had two choices: bury the entire affair, execute Severus quickly, and maintain his power, or reveal the complex truth, risking his own career but potentially saving the legion. His rigid Roman discipline, forged in decades of duty, demanded the latter. Within the hour, Severus was publicly stripped of his rank and placed under close guard for transfer to Rome for formal trial, a slow, agonizing path to inevitable disgrace. This public fall, rather than a hidden execution, sent a clear, brutal message throughout the camp. Treason, even when politically motivated, would not be tolerated. The immediate threat of the Dacian forces remained. Cassian acted swiftly, utilizing the intelligence Severus had unknowingly provided. Instead of marching his full forces out, he deployed a smaller, highly disciplined decoy, reinforcing the critical passes. He ruptured the chieftain's expectation of an easy, predictable battle. The deepest consequence, however, was personal. Cassian stood before the bust of his dead son, Lucian. For 7 years, he had mourned a martyr. Now he saw a reckless boy whose ambition had ignited a personal war. The truth offered no comfort, only the crushing weight of reality. He finally wrote the report for the emperor, detailing Severus's treason and the unsettling role of Varia, the Dacian woman, as a catalyst for revealing the plot. He did not lie, but he carefully omitted the details of Lucian's direct involvement, protecting his family name only slightly. He knew the report would likely trigger his own recall, perhaps his permanent banishment from military command. He accepted the ruin of his career as the price for the legion's stability. Elias the cobbler found himself suddenly elevated. Cassian, in a quiet private meeting, not only rewarded him with 10 years military pay, enough to bring Alara home and buy land, but also appointed him the legion's custodian of records, an unnecessary but highly visible gesture of trust. "Your eyes, cobbler, saw what my power blinded me to," Cassian told him, his voice rough. "You valued the invisible thread of truth more than your own security. Rome rarely rewards such honesty, but I will." Elias took the money, the weight of the silver almost unbearable, but the true reward was the validation of his courage. He had saved the camp not with a sword, but with a piece of wood and an honest heart. The consequence for Elias was a terrifying sudden freedom, purchased at the height of danger. Weeks passed. The tactical shift worked. The Dacian forces, confused by the unexpected Roman defense, retreated before a full-scale assault could be launched. The northern frontier was secured, but the fragile peace was built on the ruins of Cassian's command. His official recall arrived swiftly from Rome, framed as a necessary change of command after a successful campaign. He was relieved of duty, but not disgraced. It was a politically managed fall from power. The day before his departure, Cassian stood before Varia's cell. She was no longer guarded. Technically, she was still a prisoner, but her testimony had been essential. "You are a free woman," Cassian stated, holding a formal liberation scroll sealed with his private ring. "You are free to return to your people. Your husband's quest for vengeance failed. He has gained only chaos." Varia took the scroll, examining the Latin script carefully. "He gained the truth, Tribune. He knew your son was not a hero. You can mourn the man, not the myth." Cassian nodded, a painful acceptance settling over him. "I leave for Rome tomorrow. I will face the Senate. What becomes of you?" "The chieftain will need assurance that I am not a collaborator," Varia replied. "I will tell them only what is true, that the Tribune, a man of rigid loyalty to Rome, chose honor over ambition, saving his legion by sacrificing his career." She paused, then gave him the first genuine, if somber, smile. "You were not the man my husband thought you were, Cassian." She took the small, worn leather pouch and carefully placed the painted blue riverstone inside. "This belongs to the cobbler, Elias. Tell him that a son's honor is often best protected by a father's duty, not his sword. I return this debt of courage." Cassian left the Praetorium not in a general's chariot, but on a simple horse traveling light, carrying only the weight of his duty discharged. He left the legion stronger than he had found it, having purged the internal corruption that threatened to consume it. He had lost his power, but he had finally found peace with his son's memory. Back in the garrison, Elias stood at the entrance, no longer working the cobbler's bench. He wore the modest, clean tunic of a Roman administrator. He held Varia's pouch, feeling the familiar, smooth surface of the riverstone inside. The silver he received was already on its way to Rome to secure his daughter Ilara's return. He looked out over the soldiers, seeing not just boots, but the lives that wore them, understanding that the greatest power was not in the command of armies, but in the small silent acts of witnessing the truth. He had traded fear for dignity and for the promise of a future with his daughter. He was no longer invisible. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more epic and emotional Roman tales like this one.